as Tracy mentioned, my group is responsible for time series analysis in Statistics Canada. The bulk of our work is on seasonal adjustment, which is sort of a type of modeling to estimate seasonal patterns and remove them so that they don't sort of come into play in the analysis. But more and more recently, we're working on modeling in general. And most of this time series modeling falls into these three categories that I'll talk about today: backcasting, forecasting, and nowcasting. So I just wanted to, in this presentation, give a sense of what's the difference between those three different types of modeling and what do they have in common, because there are a lot of things in common. And then give some examples where we've applied them in StatsCan work recently and where we're thinking of going in the future with this. So Gavin, if you could go to the next slide, please. So these are all time series models. They're all techniques that extend a time series using statistical methods. So I've got this this visual up top that has in dark blue, you'll see the series of observations box. So that's basically some data that we've produced over time, divided into months, quarters, years, whatever the case may be. But the point of this diagram is that that series of observations starts at some point in time. So that's on the left, that earliest measurement, and it ends at some point in time. So that's our most recent measurement on the right. So this is really a timeline. But it doesn't necessarily extend to the beginning of time, and it doesn't extend to the future. So at any given point in time, you can see towards the right, there's this current timeline. So now I'll go back into this this slide here. So across the top, you see this timeline where we have a time series of observations that don't extend to the current time. So right now it's the beginning of May. We've produced some of our estimates for April. Like our labor force survey comes out very quickly. So we've actually released the April results for the labor force survey. But for most of our economic indicators, the most recent month that we would have published an estimate for would be March, or maybe even February in some cases. So there's always this gap between the current time and the most recent estimate that we have available for any given series. And we find that data users are very interested in the most current possible estimates. So it's unfortunate that that gap is at the time where people are most interested in the data. So that's kind of the problem we're trying to address, or we're trying to minimize that gap and try to fill in some of the holes in that recent window, because that's what users have expressed that they really want. We'll also do some modeling at the start of the series, and I'll get more into that when we cover each of the three categories. But I just wanted to get across that we need to have a time series of data that starts and ends at a certain point and doesn't cover to the current period. And then we can use time series models to extend that series. One other thing I'll just mention is, in order for something to be a time series, it has to be consistently measured across that span of time. Anytime that concepts are changed or methods are changed, or different things that might disrupt the measurement of it, it makes it more difficult to analyze it as a time series. We're really looking for something that's consistent over the entire time that the data is available. So that's just a point I wanted to make. So if we have this time series, then we can take advantage of some of the predictable features over time. So for example, long-term trends. If we were to look at the population of Canada over a long period of time, we'd see growth in general. So a positive movement from period to period that kind of isn't always the same magnitude, but over a long period of time, we would have seen an increase. It'd be similar with things that are economic because of inflation and forces like that tend to move the measurement in a certain direction over a long period of time. So we can build those into our models, and we call those long-term trends. There's also cyclical patterns. So the business cycle comes into play, where you sort of have this this pattern of stronger and weaker increases and even stronger and weaker decreases that kind of repeats. It's sort of the business cycle of expansion and contraction and recession and all those typical movements that we see that repeat over time. Not always at the same frequency. It doesn't always have a business cycle of X number of years, but more and more we can build that in. We can estimate it and build it into the time series to improve how the model fits the data. One other important aspect that we can build into time series are seasonal patterns. So if we look at our retail trade as an example, we see an uptake in retail sales every year around November and December because people are doing holiday shopping. So it's not necessarily a signal of the economy being strong or weak, but it's just has to do with sort of some cultural norms and some habits of the population in general that are very predictable. And by building those into our model, we can extend those into the periods that we're modeling to give more accurate estimates of what that estimate should be. And the last piece that I wanted to point out, and this is really important in this type of modeling, are relationships with other available data. So we're talking about one individual time series that we're trying to model, but if it has strong relationships with other time series that we have, that can sort of explain some of the unexpected movements in the series, we can use that in our model as well to improve our estimates. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a movement in the same period. So if we think about our economy, one of the things that we often measure is retail sales. I'm going to use that example probably a few times throughout this talk. And we never have the most current estimate, but in many cases, if we're going to sell something in a retail store, it's going to be made in a manufacturing plant. So if we have the estimates for manufacturing from the previous month, that might tell us something about what to expect in retail this month. So kind of supply chain kind of relationships can come into play. We can also look at, for some of our price indexes, sometimes the stock market might have a relationship. It could be anything really that moves in step or in a similar way to the variable we're trying to model. And if we can get that data for the right period of time, that can help us to improve our model. So those are the types of things that we can build into a time series model. I will point out that if you try to model a bunch of different time series, you'll have varying degrees of success based on a number of factors. Some things are just very unpredictable, and we can't expect that the model will fit very closely or that the forecasts or backcasts or nowcasts will be accurate. For example, if you're measuring something that's very volatile like oil prices, it's very hard to predict based on just time series features. That's where you may really need some kind of other data series to use to try to predict which way it's going to move in a given period. Oil prices, it's a very complex global system that dictates those prices. And so just having data on what's going on in Canada may not tell you too much about what to expect in terms of oil prices. The other thing is measurement errors come into play. So I think you've been talking about different ways to conduct surveys with different sample sizes and different quality. If there's a lot of error in our measurement of something, then that's really just kind of random noise, and it'll make it more difficult to pull out these time series features and to establish those relationships with other available data. So that's another factor that can play into the difficulty to try to model a time series, is that either the true value is possibly very volatile, or possibly the way we measure that true value has a lot of noise in it that makes it more difficult to model. So the first type of modeling, or the first application of these time series models that I want to talk about, is backcasting. So in this case, we have our time series of observations, but we'd like to know what the estimates should look like before we started measuring it. So prior to that earliest measurement. And again here, this is going to be a theme. The quality of our ability to backcast is going to depend on the strength of this model that we're able to build. So if something's very seasonal, that's going to help us to be more accurate in our modeled values before the start of the measurement. So if we can find a reliable indicator series, that's this sort of related time variable that we can use in the modeling, that will help us to extend backwards in time. Whenever we do modeling and try to apply it to a different population or a different period of time, there's some assumptions that come into play. And those are going to really be important in terms of producing precise modeled values as well. So in some cases, the series may be easy to model and we'll be able to get very accurate backcasts. In some cases, it'll be very difficult to model and the backcasts will have some quality issues. Now, this general idea of extending a series back in time, we do it in a couple different contexts at StatsCan. But in all cases, it's to extend a series back in time from where it was first measured. And as I said, strong assumptions are needed. So to give an example of where those assumptions might be questioned, at some point we decided to start measuring cell phone sales. And we probably did that fairly early on when cell phones were becoming more popular. And if you looked at it over time, you'd see a huge growth, and now it's become such an important part of the economy, but that wasn't always the case. So if we were to try to extend our time series of cell phone sales back in time, at some point we'd be entering the time window where they weren't nearly as popular, or maybe even weren't even invented. So these are the kinds of assumptions that we have to make when we're doing this modeling, is that the patterns and the relationships that we're using in the model are valid for the whole time that we're trying to predict. So that's the example with the cell phones, is that, at some point there was this really sharp growth, maybe a seasonal pattern has evolved. We wouldn't expect to find those if we had actually measured the cell phone sales in the earlier periods. So I think it's important that we realize there are assumptions and also validate those assumptions wherever possible, because in some cases they're very strong and they could lead to errors if they're not holding up. Another context where we use it at SetsCan is to adjust historical estimates to restore time series continuity. So anytime that we make a change in the methodology that causes a discontinuity, we will try to do backcasting to smooth those breaks and to fill in the gaps. So just to give you a more concrete example, let's say that we decide to include a new industry in our retail trade that previously wasn't included in the population. So if we change our target population, that's going to lead to a change in the levels, because we're going to bring in a bunch of new units that weren't in scope in the past. So we'd expect to see some kind of a break. In that example, probably an increase in the level of retail sales. That's not necessarily an indication of the economy. It's just an indication of the methodology and the change that we put in place. So in order for our users to be able to use that historical data, we need to somehow bring the past in line with the current and the estimates that we'll produce in the future. So what we do is if there's different measures of a certain concept for different stretches of time, we do backcasting to create one more continuous series. And the next slide, I believe, has an example of this. So one example is our monthly survey of manufacturers or manufacturing. Every so often, about every 5 years, we refresh our sample. So the focus of this survey is to produce month-to-month movements that are accurate. So in the survey design, what it does is we choose a sample of manufacturing establishments, and we collect from them every month for about 5 years. And what that does is it means that there's not noise introduced into the series by sample or by units leaving and entering the sample on a month-to-month basis. It's a consistent set of units that's measured over time, and weights are applied to represent the population, but it really does minimize the sampling noise that's in the month-to-month movements. But after 5 years, we feel like respondents have sort of paid their dues, and maybe we should give them a chance to rotate out. So every 5 years, we will actually change the sample, but for every month in between those sort of marking points, we'll collect data from the same units. In that month, when we change the sample, that leads to a change in the level of the estimate, because we do it all at once. So there's a fair number of units that are entering and leaving the sample, and the chances that they actually balance out and you've got the same mix of small, medium, and large leaving and entering are very slim. So we expect that there will be some kind of a break in the series due exclusively to a change in the methodology, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So at the end of the day, the future periods from that point on will be measured based on the new sample, but the historical data that we have is all estimated based on the old sample. In this example, in December 2017, we started producing the estimates based on the new sample. So we would have seen this artificial change between November and December of 2017. And we don't want to have that sharp break in our data. So we do what's called a backcasting to sort of re-estimate the past. I think there's animation here, Gavin. If you can click, it should produce a graph. There we go. So let me just explain this graph a little bit. You see a black line, a red line, and it may not be clear, but there's a blue dot at the last point in the series. On the red line ends with a blue dot. So what we've done here is we've always been collecting under the old sample, and that's given us the black line of estimates. This is for a specific industry in manufacturing, and you can see that there's some kind of a seasonal pattern. It's a monthly series, so there's a line at each January. And what happens in this industry is that the manufacturing sales are highest in the summer, and then they decrease through the winter, and then they come back again next summer. So there's this seasonal pattern that's fairly clear. Doesn't repeat exactly the same way every year, but what we do see in common to all those years is that the summer seems to be the busier period, and January is sort of the minimum or the bottom of the trough over the winter. So we've been collecting the data and publishing the data from the black line over time, and that's what we've used to estimate the month-to-month movements and the strength of the manufacturing industry. Then all of a sudden, for December of 2017, we produced the estimate, and it's the blue dot, and that's based on the new sample. So if we were to just put the historical black line together with the blue dot, which will become a blue line going forward based on the new sample, we'd see this sharp drop between November and December of 2017, and we feel that's artificial. And the reason we feel that's artificial is we've actually collected the old sample for December of 2017, which is the final black dot. So that movement between November and December of 2017 from the old sample is a slight increase, and that's what you see in that last segment of the black line. But if we were to just all of a sudden switch to the new sample, we'd see a decrease from the second to last black dot to the last blue dot, which would be artificial and would be, in my opinion, a misleading signal of the manufacturing sector in that month. So what we do is we apply a benchmarking technique or a backcasting model that will try as much as possible to preserve the movements from the black line for each month, but match up to the blue dot, the level of the blue dot in the final point. And the result is this red line. And the method that we use actually will exactly hit that blue dot. The movement in the red line between November and December is very similar to the movement in the black line from November to December. And actually that's the case for all the months. But what you see is that the gap between the red line and the black line shrinks as you go further back. So the estimate for December of 2012 is actually unchanged, whether it's the red line or the black line. And then they gradually get a bit further apart every period until we get to December of 2017. And as we go forward from that point, we'll add new points based on the new sample, which will line up with that blue dot. And what we'll in the end have is sort of a continuous series, as if there were no artificial break, and as if we had always been measuring the series based on the new sample. We'll never know what the actual estimates would have been for that new sample, but under the statistical theory, the red line does give us sort of the most likely estimate for each period and preserve those movement very, very closely. So that's an example of backcasting. Now, if we turn to forecasting, it's essentially the same thing. We build a time series model, but our goal is to extend the time series forwards and not backwards from the beginning, but forwards from the end of the series. Forecasts are currently produced at StatsCan in a few contexts, but mainly they're not published externally. I'll talk about a policy, I think, on the next slide, but we do use them as intermediate inputs to different processes. For example, seasonal adjustment does use some forecasting to make the estimates more robust, but we don't actually publish the forecasts. They're just used kind of behind the scenes in the seasonal adjustment process. The one exception, or there are some external projections, mostly in terms of demographics, and those are usually produced based on not necessarily a model, but a micro simulation where you sort of model the population and introduce some effects that are then you can aggregate from your modeled population to see what sort of a scenario analysis, what would happen if this was the effect, what would happen if this were the effect. And those assumptions are very explicitly spelled out. The next slide, please. So I said we don't generally publish forecasts. There are some exceptions. And in fact, we do have a policy on estimates with future reference dates, which is really what forecasting amounts to. But it's in a sense, the validity of the forecasting model is based on some strong assumptions. And sometimes those assumptions can be subjective. And one of the underlying assumptions is that there's no unexpected shocks. So if you can imagine at the end of 2019, if we had forecasted 2020, we did not have any idea what the impact of the pandemic would be. And our forecasts would have had some very large errors in that example. So, that sort of relates to the unexpected shocks, but it also would open it up to being seen as something subjective, because those assumptions that we would build in to generate the forecasts could be manipulated to show different kinds of results. So as an objective statistical agency, we really avoid that at all costs. And one way to avoid that is not to generally publish forecasts. That being said, I did mention that there are some situations where we do publish what can be seen as forecasts, and we have this policy below. I just took a little excerpt from the policy. I apologize if it's too small to read, but the bottom line is that the estimates are consistent with objectivity and professionalism. So they have to be based on mathematical models. Those models have to be clearly defined and presented. You have to be able to use that model with the data and reproduce the results, sort of the basic scientific principle. So we do have some criteria. And the other thing is we have to produce it under different scenarios and not identify which scenario we feel is the most likely. That's where some subjectivity could creep in. So we have this very objective criteria for publishing forecasts, and many of our forecasts wouldn't meet that criteria. So we keep them and maybe use them internally, but don't publish them where they could be used by users that don't understand the consequences and the methods used to produce them. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So now I'll talk about nowcasting, which is quite similar to forecasting, but there is one key difference. In nowcasting, we use time series models. We're extending the time series forward, but not as far as a forecast. So in nowcasting, we don't extend the data beyond the current time. So we're sort of forecasting the recent past as opposed to the future. So there's a definition that was proposed by Eurostat. Nowcasting is a very early estimate produced for an economic variable of interest over the most recent reference period, calculated on the basis of incomplete data using a statistical or econometric model different from the one used for regular estimates. So I highlighted a few of the things that I think are key points in red very early. So the point is to get a reliable number out as soon as possible. Over the most recent reference period, so that sort of identifies that we're not forecasting the future. It's only the most recent past. Calculated on the basis of incomplete data. So we recognize that we don't have all the data at the current time. More data may come and we may use it differently in the future. But for this nowcast, we can at least use the data that we do have at our disposal. And an economic, statistical or econometric model different from the one used for regular estimates. So that sort of opens the door to using a model to predict an estimate that will eventually come from a survey or some other kind of method like that. So
Steve, there is a question, and it's just asking about, it says, can you use this for like social variables of interest as well?
I've seen it more often used for economic variables. I don't see any reason that you couldn't use it for social variables, depending on the type of estimates. Often in a social setting, you're estimating proportions more so than totals, but these models can be fit to proportions just as well as totals. So I think the answer is yes, but I have seen it more commonly in an economic setting. One other thing that maybe I'll just highlight here is that part of the reason that we don't go into the future with nowcasting is because these models really rely on data, like an auxiliary variable, to make them robust to shocks like a pandemic or a recession or things like that. So we need to be able to pick up some other variable that's going to indicate those shocks and how they should affect the measurement. And if we're only dealing with the recent past, there's a good chance that there will be some data available to help us. If we're going into the future, we're modeling a period that hasn't happened yet. Sorry, my light keeps going off. And if we're doing that, then we're forced to make an assumption that the future is going to look a lot like the data that we have, which I feel is a very strong assumption. So that's what I see as a big distinction between nowcasting and forecasting, is the type of data that you can use in the model. And just one last aspect of this definition is that the idea of incomplete data sort of indicates that we will get more information and we'll use it And the way we use the data may be different in our what we call our regular estimate, which we'll produce eventually. But that's the distinction between the blue part of the line is all based on the typical method, and the red part could be based on a model or a different method than the regular estimates. Okay, we can move on, please. Thank you. So nowcasting for real-time estimation. What I've got here is just a slightly different diagram of the time series where you see that we've started to measure a certain variable at time 1. So we have our y1 is our estimate of the time 1 total, and that extends up to yt minus 1. And let's say we're at time t right now. So we're in May, t minus 1 might be April. So we may have an estimate available for April. I think there's some animation here, Gavin, if you wouldn't mind just, yeah. So what that means is that there's always a gap. If we're saying that the current time is where that variable of interest arrow starts, there's always this gap between the current time and the most recent available estimate. So I think if you can click again, what we're trying to do is fill in that gap. There may still be some kind of a gap, but at least it won't be as long, and hopefully that data will be useful for our data users. So in terms of that gap, looking at Stats Canada's website, we have a number of estimates that we label as major economic releases. These are the key mission critical programs that we produce that are used very heavily by analysts and external users. If we look at all of our annual major economic releases, the lag for our first data point right now is 195 days, meaning that our first estimate for 2020 will be, on average, be released 195 days into 2021. So that's about a 6-month lag, which is quite long for data users to wait to use them in policy decisions and just general analysis. For our quarterly products, on average, the lag is 62 days, or about 2 months. So that means our estimate for the fourth quarter of 2020 won't come out until 2 months into 2021. And for a monthly program, that lag is about 39 days, or about a month, a bit more than a month. So this is what we're trying to reduce with this nowcasting. We fully recognize that there's a reason that there's this lag. There's a lot of work involved in producing a survey, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And that can't always be sped up too much more than it already has been. Recently, there's been pressure to try to compress those production schedules to reduce that lag. But I feel like we're pretty close to the limit in terms of how much we can do in a short time. So we're trying to find other ways to maybe release some information earlier than when we can produce an official survey estimate. So to do that, we've been doing some exercises to try different models on different data, evaluation studies to look at how useful they are for our users, how much resource or how many resources are required to support this kind of work, and what kind of quality can we expect to get in the end? Is it good enough for the users to actually benefit from, or are we just producing something that's so inaccurate that it's really not of any use to anyone? So those are the types of questions we've tried to answer through some proof of concept exercises. And I'll show a couple of those now. But first, so I have this diagram. I think one thing that I want to, as a key takeaway from this talk, is that a lot of these models, the key is to find data that helps you to explain what's going on in the data you're trying to model. So again, we've got this variable of interest across the top. You could use just a straight time series model with no other data, and you could estimate patterns like seasonal patterns and trends like long-term trends in business cycles to come up with an estimate for the current period YT. But that would be based on that assumption that this period is not really any different from anything else and there's no shock. So there's a risk there. So what we want to do is with a time series model, we could predict YT, but it would be fairly risky because it wouldn't use any current information. So where can we get this current information? We can look at statistical outputs. So other estimates that are produced from StatsCan could be used as a statistical output that's related to the variable of interest, if there is a relationship there. And we can use a model to establish that relationship and impose that relationship on time period T to produce a forecast that's a bit more founded in some real data. We could do the same thing with partial outputs. I mentioned that surveys take some time to process, but our data collection period we don't get all the data on one day. It sort of accumulates throughout a month while we're doing follow-up and things like that. So at each point in time, we have a certain share of the responses that we will receive. And the larger that share is, I think the more useful and the more we can expect that it will give us a good indication of what's going to happen in time period T. So as that data accumulates, it can be used in a model to help and stabilize our forecasts or nowcasts. And then this is a more recent thing, but there's all kinds of secondary data available. Wasn't always the case, but now I think you can read papers where people are using all kinds of different things as a predictor. A couple of examples, sort of from the world of big data, people use Google Trends. You can create a time series from Google that sort of measures how often a certain search term has been queried each month. And if you build a time series on help wanted, maybe that's related to employment. The more people are querying help wanted or jobs, the more maybe there are available or people out of work looking for work. So you can get a little creative here and try to find things that would be related to the variable of interest. So one example is Google Trends. We've had some studies, I'll show one a bit later, where we've used some data on weather. If we're measuring something that's affected by weather, we can now get data daily, hourly, whatever the case may be, on temperature, precipitation, different aspects of the weather that may affect the variable we're trying to measure. Newspaper articles. There's now databases that have a wealth of newspaper articles that you can mine to build an index of how often was the word recession used in the newspaper articles on a given day, week, or month. And that may be an indicator on the direction of the economy. So there's all kinds of secondary data sources now that we can access, process, and include in a model. And I don't want to make it seem like it's easy, because often that access and process part is time consuming and needs to be done carefully. But if we really want to improve the precision of our models, we can now do that with different sources of data. So the red arrow right now is just a time series model that doesn't use any of that other data. But if you can hit the animation, Gavin, what we can do if we can get that data is we can build relationships with the variable of interest and use them to produce a better estimate of YT that is using some real data from time period T. So it can be expected to pick up on shocks like recessions and pandemics, for example, that are affecting these other outputs in a similar way. Okay. So now I'll just talk quickly about a couple of examples where we've done some work along these lines, sort of as a case study. The first is from international trade. So we produce monthly estimates of imports and exports broken down by different commodity groups and trading partners or countries. To produce our exports from Canada, we have a data sharing agreement with the US Census Bureau, where each month they'll provide us on data on their imports between Canada and the US, which are our exports, and vice versa. We provide data to them on our imports, which are their exports. Now in December 2018, there was a US government shutdown, which meant that we were not able to access the data for December. But we do have users that rely on these estimates, so we needed to look at alternative ways to produce the estimates of exports by commodity and trading partner. So we looked at time series modeling. I say in this slide a nowcast, but in the end, we weren't able to pull together quickly enough any external data to use. So it was really more like a forecast. But it did include a seasonal component because exports are very seasonal, a trend cycle. There is a business cycle that affects these estimates, moving holiday effects. Just as a quick example, on Easter, the customs offices are closed, or if not closed, operating at a very reduced capacity. So if Easter is in April or March, can dictate the level that we'd expect for those 2 months. And similarly, trading day effects. If you have a month that has 5 weekends, well, actually, customs offices are less busy on the weekends. So that would affect the level that you'd expect, and we can build that into the model to make it more accurate. So we fitted this model to each of the commodities in terms of our exports to the United States. And I think I have a graph on the next slide that shows some results. Um, what I did is on the graph on the right, each of the dots is a different commodity for the month of December 2018. And on the horizontal axis, you'll see the observed value. Eventually, we did get the data. And so we were able to compare our forecasts with the real value. So on the x-axis or the horizontal axis is the eventual observed value, and on the vertical axis is the forecasted value. If all of our forecasts were perfect, every blue dot would be on that straight line with a slope of 1. That's not the case. But what we were pleased to see is that the order of magnitude is fairly accurate. And for the most part, they're very close to that line. The few that are further from the line, unfortunately, one of them is a fairly large value, but that I believe is an energy commodity, which is known to be hard to predict, driven by prices and demand and all kinds of complex relationships. So we were not surprised to see that it wasn't as accurate, but especially for some of the ones of a smaller magnitude. So towards the left part of the graph, most of the estimates are very close to the line. So we were pleased to see that the forecasts were doing a good job of actually estimating what we were going to receive based on real data. So when we produced these forecasts, we actually generated a prediction interval or a confidence interval for the model value. And as I say, the data, eventually we did receive the data once the shutdown was over, and we processed it and published it. So we had that true value to compare to. If we looked at the total aggregate exports to the US, our forecasts were within 1.5% of the true value. And looking at individual commodities, there's about 100 commodities on this graph. About half of them had an error more than 7.5%. So the other half had an error less than 7.5%. And only about 1 out of 10 had an error that was very large, 30%. So those are, overall, we felt like at the aggregate level, the precision was pretty good and the forecasts were useful. As you got down to more detailed levels, we felt like it was important to take into account the confidence interval because they weren't as precise. And if we wanted to make them more precise, the key would be picking up some kind of auxiliary data to use in our models that would signal maybe a stronger than expected or weaker than expected movement. For exports, it could be something like domestic manufacturing. If our domestic manufacturing is high, maybe we'd expect the exports to be high as well. But that's where there's some creativity that comes into play to try to find a variable that will help us and get our hands on it, prepare it, use it in the model, and try to improve the forecasts. So that's the first example I wanted to show. The second one is related to tourism. So we produce on a monthly basis what we call frontier counts, which are counts of cars crossing the border to the United States at different border crossings or land ports. Historically, we've gotten monthly totals from the United States Customs and Border Protection, sort of a similar relationship with the imports and exports, where the US Border Agency will provide us with data on how many cars pass through the ports of entry to the US in a given month. Recently, though, we get an electronic source of the data, and it's actually daily counts rather than monthly counts at those same land ports. So given this daily extract, which we receive not every day, but in sort of 1 week batches, I believe, we thought we could try to use a time series model on the daily counts to nowcast the monthly counts. So what I show in this graph below is a daily graph or a daily series of the number of cars entering the US at a specific land port or border crossing. So there is it's hard to see the axis, I apologize for that, but it spans about 1.5 years. So looking at it, we see that there is a seasonal component. There's a bit of an increase around the summer, decrease in the winter. There is a day of the week component. That's that sort of repeated pattern that you see that's about every 7 days. There's some sort of a trend cycle that's taking place here too, where the level is maybe gradually increasing over time. There's some holiday effects. A lot of these spikes that we found were associated with Victoria Day, which I believe what's happening and what's explaining those spikes is that there's some cross-border long weekend shopping trips that are happening around those holidays. And the spike is relatively the same size in the 2 years. So I've indicated the Victoria Day holiday in those graphs that explains 2 of those large upward spikes. And then there's also some downward spikes, which we found very interesting. we were able to access some weather data. And in Canada, we get snowstorms. And when there's a snowstorm, people are reluctant to drive. It's a little bit more dangerous. So what we found is a relationship between the number of cars crossing the border and the snowfall on a given day. So we were able to build that into the model. And what we saw is that on days where we knew there was going to be snowfall, we expected lower volumes of cars, and that's what we saw exactly in the data. There was one other interesting point that it wasn't explained by a holiday or a snowfall, but when we checked the newspaper, what we found is that there had been a forecast for a large snowfall that didn't actually happen. But still, we saw a big decrease in the volume of cars crossing the border on that day. So people were reacting to the expectation of snow, not necessarily seeing the snow in the sky, but knowing that it was coming and perhaps choosing to stay home rather than take a trip over the weekend. So some weather effects were built into this model as well. If we can go to the next slide. So what we were planning to do is in order to produce an earlier estimate of the monthly count, we could take, let's say, the first couple of weeks of daily counts and predict the rest of the month, and then add that all up to come up with our monthly estimate or a monthly count. So what we expected to see was that if we use the first week of data and forecast the rest of the month, that would give us a certain accuracy. If we use the first 2 weeks of real data and forecasted fewer days, we get more accurate. If we use the first 3 weeks and only forecasted the last 1 week, we get even more accurate. So what you see here is that if we're only forecasting a 1 week horizon, our monthly count was on average within 3.25%. If we forecasted the last 2 weeks, it was about 4.25%, and 3 weeks, 5.25%. So it sort of illustrates that trade-off between timeliness and precision. The longer you wait and the more real data you use, the more accurate or precise you expect your monthly aggregate to be, and vice versa. So the lessons learned from this: more observed counts leads to a better accuracy. Using the weather data and the holiday effects really did improve the model. But for example, that anecdote I gave you about the forecasted snowfall, we don't have data on the forecast for every day that we can sort of pair up with the real snowfall and use both in the model. But I think it illustrates just a general idea that you can start with a simple model and you can add more and more effects to sort of refine your model. And at some point you've indicated or you've included the most significant effects, and you could go further, you could get more data, but I think the gains in precision would get less and less as you add more and more variables. So in particular, that border crossing is close to Buffalo in New York. And we know that when there's a big concert or a big sporting event in Buffalo, quite often Canadians will go there to participate. If we could gather some data on the attendance at events taking place in Buffalo, that may help to give us more accurate forecasts. But at some point, you've done enough to make the estimates accurate enough to be usable, and you just live with the model and treat the rest as random noise. So there's kind of a diminishing returns as you add more and more variables into the model. Sure, they'll probably improve it, but by less and less. So you have to start to question if it's worth the extra effort to bring in that data and use it. Do I have another example or? Okay, so I just wanted to mention, so this is really, this whole nowcasting and increasing timeliness is a priority for StatsCan. So we're planning to do more and more of this type of work and more case studies. We work closely with the subject matter experts from different areas because they often have really good insight into what are the types of data that might be useful in the models and how accurate does a given series need to be for it to be useful for the users. So we're still working on some of the case studies that we've recently started on and worked on. One based on retail trade, where there's quite a bit of auxiliary data that we can use. One based on energy exports, where the subject matter analysts identified a link with domestic production of energy and how much is exported. We're working on some annual estimates. As I showed in the earlier slide, there's a fairly long lag between when we can produce, before we can produce an annual estimate. But in many cases, we have an annual or a monthly counterpart that's measuring the same thing on a monthly basis. So that can serve as data to use in a model for the annual estimates. Another area where we'd like to increase the timeliness or improve the timeliness is on price indices. And there's a lot of different alternate data source that can be used in those models. And this list just keeps growing. It's something that we're really interested in and trying to push forward. In some cases, the results are very promising, in others they're not. So we plan to try to keep evaluating more and more cases to do this kind of modeling. Next slide. Yeah, so just a few key takeaways. I think that's all that I really am going to cover. I haven't left much time for questions. I apologize, but I just wanted to give a sense of what types of things can be built into a time series model: long-term trends, seasonal patterns, calendar effects, those kinds of things. That those models are often used to extend the series either back in time, backcasting, or into the future, forecasting. And that the quality really varies, and it depends on the stability of the series and the available information that you can find to sort of strengthen the model. And then I want to also make this distinction between nowcasting and forecasting, where we do some forecasting, but mainly for internal use. And as I just sort of talked about, we're planning to develop nowcasting more and more at Stats Canada. We want to be able to use many predictor variables. There's modern methods that are available to do that we're exploring. We want to improve our timeliness as a supplement to our regular traditional estimates. And one final comment I'll just make is that during the pandemic, there was really this push to give the most timely possible data. So we started to release some nowcasts, and they were very well received by the users. In most cases, they were also fairly accurate. We had a few where the revisions or the errors were a bit larger, but we've studied those and tried to learn from it. But overall, given the feedback we've had from users with doing this kind of work, we expect to continue and only increase it. It's kind of hard once you've released something to stop releasing it. So I expect this is an area that will probably grow more and more in the data that we put out.